The most dangerous woman in New Orleans was threading white silk ribbons through a wealthy plantation owner's daughter's hair. When she learned the secret that would make her richer than any freed slave in Louisiana. And the young woman confessing her sins had no idea she was handing the hairdresser a weapon worth more than her father's entire cotton empire. New Orleans, March 1819. The air in the Beaumont mansion's private dressing room hung thick with humidity and expensive French perfume. Marie Laveau stood behind Marguerite Beaumont, her fingers working methodically through the 18-year-old's hair, plaiting and pinning with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that invisibility was survival. At 18 herself, Marie was already known among New Orleans' white elite as the best hairdresser in the French Quarter, a free woman of color whose skills made her indispensable and whose discretion made her trusted. That discretion was a lie. "He says he loves me," Marguerite whispered, watching Marie's reflection in the ornate mirror. The young woman's eyes were red from crying. "He promised we would go to Paris together, away from Papa and this awful city. But he needs money for the passage, and Papa refuses to increase his allowance until after the harvest." Marie's hands never stopped moving. She had learned early that white people talked freely around servants who appeared not to be listening. Free woman of color or not, to people like the Beaumonts, she was still part of the furniture, decorative, useful, and utterly invisible when it came to matters that actually counted. "Your father is a cautious man," Marie said quietly, her Creole accent soft and unthreatening. "He protects you." "He suffocates me," Marguerite corrected, her voice rising slightly before dropping to a whisper again. "Laurent, that is, Monsieur Duchamp. He says Papa is old-fashioned, that in Paris we could live as we choose, but the ship leaves in 3 weeks, and if I cannot access my inheritance early—" She trailed off, then added in a rush, "Laurent says there is a way. My dowry is held in Papa's name at the Bank of Louisiana, but the paperwork could be adjusted. Laurent knows a clerk there who could transfer the funds if I had my mother's signature, but Mama would never agree. So Laurent suggested I might forge it. Just this once, just to secure our future." In the mirror, Marie's expression remained perfectly neutral, though her mind was already calculating. Marguerite Beaumont was preparing to embezzle $20,000 from her own family to fund a romantic escape with a man who was almost certainly a fortune hunter. The information was valuable, not to prevent the crime, but to leverage it. If Marie told Judge Beaumont what his daughter planned, she would earn his gratitude. But gratitude from rich white men was fleeting and worthless. If she stayed silent and waited, she could use the knowledge later, when it would be worth far more than a simple thank you. "Your hair is finished, mademoiselle," Marie said, stepping back. The elaborate updo made Marguerite look older, more sophisticated. Ready for Paris, perhaps, though Paris would never see her. Laurent Duchamp would take the money and disappear, leaving Marguerite ruined and her family humiliated. Marie had seen it before. White girls with money and romantic notions were easy prey for men with charm and debts. "It is beautiful," Marguerite breathed, turning her head to admire Marie's work. "You are truly an artist, Marie. Papa complains about what he pays you, but I always tell him no one else in New Orleans has your skill." Marie accepted the compliment with a small smile and collected her payment. $3 for 2 hours of work, a fortune by the standards of most free people of color, but a pittance compared to what she could have earned if her skin were a different shade. She packed her ribbons and combs into her worn leather case and left through the servants' entrance, as was expected. The walk back to her small rented room on Rue Dauphine took 20 minutes through streets that smelled of baking bread and horse manure, and the particular sweetness of sugar being processed at the refineries near the river. New Orleans in 1819 was a city of contradictions, French and Spanish and American all at once, slave and free existing in uncomfortable proximity, wealth and poverty separated by a single street. Marie was a contradiction herself. Her mother, Catherine, had been a slave, the property of a white Creole planter named Charles Laveau. Her father was that same Charles Laveau, who had acknowledged Marie as his daughter and granted her freedom papers at birth, a rare act of conscience that set her apart from the thousands of enslaved people who would never experience such mercy. Catherine had not been so fortunate. She remained enslaved until Charles died in 1814, at which point his legitimate white children sold her to a plantation upriver, where she died 2 years later from yellow fever and exhaustion. Marie had been 16 when her mother died, old enough to understand that freedom was arbitrary, that the piece of paper declaring her libre was worth only as much as the white people around her chose to respect it. Old enough to understand that survival required more than legal status. It required money, information, and power, none of which came freely to women who looked like her. She had started working as a hairdresser because it was one of the few professions open to free women of color that paid more than laundry or sewing. But Marie was ambitious in ways that made other free people of color nervous. She did not simply dress hair. She listened. She remembered. She collected secrets the way other women collected jewelry, storing each confession, each whispered indiscretion, each financial detail in her sharp memory for future use. The Marguerite Beaumont situation was perfect. In 3 weeks, when the girl attempted to access her dowry and was caught, Judge Beaumont would be desperate to contain the scandal. Marie would visit him then, offering not sympathy, but a solution. She knew a discreet banker who could handle delicate situations. She knew a convent in Baton Rouge that accepted troubled young women for extended retreats. No questions asked. She knew how to make problems disappear for a price. And the price would not be money, though money would be part of it. The price would be favors, introductions, access to the networks of power that controlled New Orleans. Judge Beaumont would owe her, and men in debt to Marie Laveau tended to stay in debt because she never collected all at once. She collected in pieces, in opportunities, in doors opened and blinds eyes turned. She reached her room just as evening fell, the gas lights beginning to flicker to life along the streets. The room was small, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a trunk for her possessions. But it was hers, paid for with her own labor. On the table sat a ledger, its pages filled with Marie's careful handwriting. Names, dates, secrets. The real currency of New Orleans, recorded in ink that could ruin reputations with a single revelation. But tonight Marie added a new entry. Not about Marguerite Beaumont. That would be recorded later, when the situation matured. Tonight's entry was about something else entirely. A property auction she had attended that afternoon, ostensibly to bid on a writing desk, but actually to observe the sale of human beings. 3 slaves had been sold. 2 men, 1 woman. The woman's name was listed as Josephine, age 16, described in the auction catalog as excellent house servant, skilled in cooking and cleaning, Docile temperament. The winning bid was $350, paid by a merchant named Etienne Garnier. Marie wrote down the details, not out of sympathy, but out of strategy. Garnier was one of her clients. His wife employed Marie monthly for hairdressing. And Garnier, Marie had learned through careful listening, was in financial difficulty. Within 6 months, perhaps a year, he would need to sell assets. When that time came, Marie intended to buy Josephine, not to free her. Marie had no interest in freedom for its own sake. Freedom was a tool, useful only when it served a purpose. She would buy Josephine and put her to work, probably in one of the white households where Marie already operated, collecting information and reporting back. A trusted slave was more effective than a free employee because a slave had no choice but loyalty. A slave could not quit, could not refuse, could not betray, not without risking everything. It was practical. It was profitable. And it was exactly what white people had been doing for generations. Marie saw no reason why she should not use the same system to build her own power. Outside, the night sounds of New Orleans rose, music from the taverns, shouting from the docks, the perpetual rhythm of a city that never quite slept. Marie closed her ledger and prepared for bed, her mind already working through the possibilities that lay ahead. She had been born into a world that treated her as less than human because of her mother's status and her skin's color. She had no intention of accepting that position. If the world was built on the backs of slaves, then Marie Laveau would climb that same ladder. And when she reached the top, she would look down at all the people, black and white alike, who had underestimated the small, quiet hairdresser, who remembered everything and forgot nothing. The system had made her what she was. Now she would make the system work for her, no matter who she had to step on to get there. By the summer of 1830, every rich woman in New Orleans knew that if Marie Laveau was touching her hair, she needed to be careful what she said, because somewhere in the city there was a slave owned by Marie, scrubbing her floors or serving her tea, quietly listening for the exact same secrets. The first slave Marie bought with her own money did not even realize she had changed owners. Josephine still woke up in the same cramped servants' quarters, still cooked in the same hot kitchen, still answered to the same petty orders from Madame Garnier. Only the name on the ownership papers, locked away in a drawer at the notary's office, had changed. Etienne Garnier had been drowning in gambling debts, and when Marie appeared with cash and a polite suggestion that purchasing Josephine might help ease his financial distress, he agreed before she finished the sentence. On paper, it was an ordinary transaction. A free woman of color purchasing a household servant was not unheard of in New Orleans. The city's twisted social hierarchy meant that some free black people owned slaves while still being denied basic rights themselves. What made this sale different was the purpose. Marie did not buy Josephine to cook or clean. She bought her to listen. "You will continue exactly as before," Marie told her in the tiny courtyard behind her house on Rue Dauphine. The ink on the bill of sale barely dry. "Same work, same mistress, same bed. The only difference is this. When Madame has guests, when she talks about money, when she quarrels with Monsieur, especially when she quarrels with Monsieur, you remember everything. And every Sunday, after Mass, you come here and tell me what you heard." Josephine was 16, with quick eyes and the wary posture of someone who knew that survival depended on understanding danger before it arrived. She looked at Marie with a mixture of fear and something like hope. "And if I forget?" she asked. Marie held her gaze. "You will not forget," she said gently, "because what you remember could be the difference between freedom and the rest of your life in chains. Do you understand?" The promise was not entirely a lie. Marie did free slaves on rare occasions, those who had served their purpose and whose manumission could be turned into a public relations triumph. But for Josephine and most others, freedom would remain a carrot always dangled, never delivered. Within a year, Marie owned 7 more slaves placed strategically in the homes of her wealthiest clients. Some worked as housemaids, others as cooks or nursemaids. Each had a route back to Marie, a market errand that just happened to pass near her house, a weekly visit to a relative whose landlord was Marie, a confessor's bench in St. Louis Cathedral, where Marie sat 2 pews behind, listening with the focus of a predator. The information that flowed from these human channels was worth more than any plantation. Madame Rochefort's secret morphine addiction, Judge Delacroix's unacknowledged mixed-race son, Governor Claiborne's private letters about pending land disputes, debt, infidelity, illegitimate children, bribes. Every secret deposited itself in Marie's memory, catalogued and cross-referenced, until she could have drawn a map of the city's corruption with her eyes closed. News of her miracles spread accordingly. A merchant facing bankruptcy went to Marie's small house behind the cathedral, desperate and ashamed. He left with a folded piece of paper containing the name of a creditor who would unexpectedly forgive part of his debt after receiving a discreet visit from Marie with certain letters in hand. A society lady whose husband had taken up with an opera singer woke screaming from nightmares of snakes and graves. Marie performed a nighttime ritual in Congo Square, candles flickering, drums beating, vive symbols chalked on the earth. 3 days later, the husband ended the affair, not because of spirits, but because Marie had kindly informed him that his mistress's jealous former lover, a dock worker with a violent reputation, had just been hired at the same warehouse where he kept his cotton, and accidents could happen. To outsiders, the results looked supernatural. To Marie, they were simply the logical consequences of knowing exactly which nerve to press and when. Her reputation as a voodoo queen grew in parallel with her financial empire. Wealthy clients paid in gold, silver, and favors. Poorer clients paid in gossip, which she valued just as highly. The city's white elite preferred to believe that Marie's power came from dark gods and mysterious rituals. The truth that it came from their own carelessness, their own belief that a black woman in their parlor posed no threat, would have been far more frightening. By 1835, Marie owned multiple properties across New Orleans: a boarding house on St. Philip Street, a small tavern near the river, a laundry on Rampart. On the ledgers, each business was run by a trusted manager. In reality, those managers were slaves, whose obedience was enforced not just by the lash, though Marie did not hesitate to use it, but by the knowledge that stepping out of line could mean being sold downriver to the sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in seasons. She told herself it was necessary. The world did not change because one woman decided she was too moral to participate in its uglier machinery. White planters did not free their slaves. They passed them down in wills like furniture. Judges did not suddenly grant rights to free people of color. They used them when convenient and discarded them when not. If Marie wanted power in that world, she had to play by its rules, and then twist those rules until they served her interests, instead of those of the men who had written them. The first time she ordered a whipping, she did not watch. Céline, a young housemaid who had been caught pocketing a brooch from a client's dressing table, knelt in the courtyard with her hands tied to an iron ring in the wall. Marie gave instructions to Henri, one of her male slaves, to administer 10 lashes. Then she went inside and closed the shutters. The screams reached her anyway. She sat at her desk, hands clasped tightly enough to leave crescent marks in her palms, and forced herself to breathe steadily. Theft could not be tolerated. If her slaves began stealing from clients, the entire network would collapse. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild in a city where every white household already treated black bodies as guilty by default. Marie understood this. She had grown up watching white mistresses blame slaves for missing items they themselves had misplaced. But knowing the logic did nothing to soften the sound of Céline's voice cracking on the 4th lash. When Henry came to say it was done, sweat soaking his shirt despite the evening cool, Marie nodded and told him to untie Céline, give her water, and put salve on the wounds. "And tell her," Marie added, her voice flat, "that the next time she thinks of stealing from a client, she should remember that the river is always hungry." The next day, Marie visited the client whose brooch had been taken, an older white woman prone to dramatics. She apologized for the foolishness of an undisciplined girl, promised that the culprit had been punished, and offered a discount on future services. The client, mollified, not only forgave the incident, but praised Marie's firm hand. "She understands our ways better than most of her kind," the woman remarked to a friend, not realizing that Marie, standing 2 rooms away, could hear every word. Their ways. Marie filed the phrase in the same internal ledger where she stored secrets. Their ways had stolen her mother and consigned her people to generations of bondage. Now she was using those ways against them, even if it meant becoming something that, once upon a time, she would have called monstrous. Her power moved beyond whispered consultations and midnight rituals the year a state senator's son killed a man in a duel. The duel itself was illegal, of course, but in Louisiana, illegality and tradition often coexisted comfortably. What made this duel different was the victim, a white abolitionist from the North, whose death threatened to ignite political scandal at a time when tensions over slavery were already simmering. The senator came to Marie in person, his hat in his hands, his arrogance stripped away by fear. "My boy's foolish," he said, pacing her small parlor as she watched from the chair opposite. "But he is all I have. If this goes to trial, if the newspapers learn that he killed a man who spoke against slavery, they will make him a symbol. They will make me a symbol. I cannot allow that." Marie poured tea, the gesture calm and precise. "And what do you expect me to do, Senator? I am a hairdresser, a humble spiritual advisor. I do not control your courts." "You control people," he said, stopping to face her. "I know you do. Judges, jurors, sheriffs. You hear their wives' confessions. You know their debts, their lovers, their sins. I need them to forget what my son has done, or at least to see it differently." There it was, the open admission of what others only suspected. He believed in her power, not in spirits or saints, but in the leverage she held over men like him. And he was willing to pay. "What would it be worth to you?" Marie asked quietly. "If your son escaped the gallows." He swallowed. Anything is a dangerous word, Senator. I mean it. She named a price. 3 properties near the riverfront. Ownership of 2 slaves skilled in bookkeeping from his household staff. And a promise of political protection if any of her activities ever came under official scrutiny. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Agreed. Marie nodded slowly. She would visit the judge assigned to the case, reminding him of certain compromising letters he had written to a quadroon mistress years before. She would speak to the sheriff, whose gambling debts she had helped settle through discreet negotiations with a creditor. She would attend Mass at St. Louis Cathedral and kneel conspicuously near 6 men likely to serve on the jury, making sure each saw her cross herself and whisper their names as she lit candles, so that when their wives later told them, wide-eyed, that Madame Laveau prayed for you today, they would feel the weight of invisible eyes upon them. When the trial concluded, the senator's son received a fine and a stern lecture about the recklessness of dueling. The abolitionist's death was officially recorded as manslaughter committed in the heat of passion. Newspapers lost interest within a week. Marie gained 3 new properties, 2 literate slaves who would become the backbone of her growing paperwork operations, and a senator who now owed her his family's future. Word of the miracle spread, as such stories always did. The version told in drawing rooms and taverns spoke of candles lit at midnight, of chickens sacrificed in hidden courtyards, of spirits summoned to twist the hearts of jurors. No one mentioned ledgers, blackmail, or the precise way fear could be applied like a scalpel to a man's conscience. By 1838, people no longer called Marie merely a hairdresser. They called her the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. It was a title she neither asked for nor rejected. Let them believe in spirits if it helped them sleep at night. The truth that their fates were being manipulated not by gods, but by a woman they had been taught to ignore, would have been far more terrifying. The first time someone tried to expose Marie Laveau as a fraud, he woke up to find that the only thing more terrifying than her so-called magic was how many powerful white men were willing to ruin his life to keep her secrets buried. Frederick Thompson arrived in New Orleans in the spring of 1856 with 2 suitcases, a letter of introduction from a Boston abolitionist society, and a conviction that evil always wore a recognizable face. In his mind, villains were plantation owners with blood on their boots, slave catchers with ropes on their saddles, judges who wrote human beings into property law with strokes of a pen. He did not expect the city's most morally complicated figure to be a middle-aged black woman whose house smelled of incense and hair oil. He heard of Marie Laveau within his first week. "You must see her," one northern merchant told him over coffee. "It is impossible to understand this city without understanding her." Frederick had no patience for superstition. He was a lawyer, trained to believe in evidence and statutes, not candles and whispers. The idea that a voodoo queen held real power struck him as a convenient myth, something locals used to explain away their own corruption. Still, his work required understanding New Orleans in all its contradictions, so he went. Marie's house on Rue Sainte-Anne was smaller than he expected. No gilded altars or dramatic symbols greeted him, just a tidy courtyard with potted plants and a front room arranged with simple chairs for visitors. The woman who greeted him wore a starched white chignon wrapped elegantly around her head, her eyes sharp and assessing above a faint, unreadable smile. "You are not from here," she observed. "My accent betrays me," he said, offering a small bow. "Frederick Thompson, ma'am. I have heard a great deal about you." "People talk," she replied, gesturing for him to sit. "They like stories. Tell me, Mr. Thompson from Boston, what story did they tell you about Marie Laveau?" He repeated some of what he had heard, how she could curse a man to sickness, how she could make a judge change his verdict, how she read the future in cards and coffee grounds. Her smile did not change. "And what do you believe?" she asked. "I believe," he said carefully, "that people give away their power when they are frightened, and that those who are not frightened often enjoy taking it." Her eyes glittered with something like amusement. A lawyer's answer, very safe. He did not ask her for a reading. He did not request a blessing or a curse. Instead, he asked questions about the free people of color who owned property, about the laws that governed them, about the unspoken rules that determined who could walk where and speak to whom without being arrested. Marie answered some questions and evaded others with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to interviews. When he asked directly about her own wealth, she only said, "A woman in my position must be prepared for whatever the future brings." It was not until weeks later, at the notary's office, where he spent his days combing through land records and manumission papers, that Frederick began to see the outline of something darker. He had been searching for evidence of illegal slave imports when a clerk handed him the wrong ledger by mistake. "Orleans Parish Property Transfers, 1830, 1855. He flipped through absent-mindedly, then stopped. "Laveau, Marie. Sale of human property. One female, age 19. Mulatress, name Delphine. Buyer, Duplantier Plantation. Price $700, date 1845. Frederick frowned. He had assumed Marie owned a few household servants, as many free people of color did. But selling a young woman to a sugar plantation, where conditions were notoriously lethal, was not the act of a benevolent protector. It was a death sentence. He turned pages. More entries appeared. Laveau, Marie. Purchase, male. Age 22, field hand. Name, Jacques. Seller, Bernard Rochefort. Price, $600. Date, 1838. Laveau, Marie. Sale, male. Age, 22. Field hand. Name, Jacques. Buyer, St. James. Parish, Sugar Co. Price, $900. Date, 1840. 2 years. She had held Jacques for 2 years, and sold him at a profit to the harshest plantations in the state. Again and again the pattern repeated. Purchases and sales, some within months of each other, the names changing but the trajectory the same. From urban household slavery, where survival at least held a flicker of possibility, to the sugar fields, where men and women worked themselves into early graves. Frederick requested older volumes. The clerks, amused by the obsessive northerner who spent his days buried in dusty ledgers, obliged. As he traced the paper trail back to Marie's earliest transactions, his initial disbelief hardened into something colder. She was not simply participating in the system. She was thriving in it. Yet in the French Quarter, people spoke of her as a savior. "She protects our girls," one quadroon mother told him proudly. "When a white man tries to take advantage, Marie intervenes. She negotiates better contracts, better support." "She freed my cousin," said a young man at a cafe. "Bought his freedom outright." Frederick dug deeper. The cousin's manumission paper existed. That much was true. But scratch the surface, and another story emerged. Marie had freed him only after he lost an arm in a stevedore accident, rendering him less useful as labor. The gesture looked compassionate in the record books. The reality was calculated. He found no evidence, none, that she had ever used her considerable wealth to purchase and free large numbers of slaves without extracting profit. Every transaction was angled, every act of apparent charity carrying a hidden ledger line in her favor. The dissonance gnawed at him. As an abolitionist, he had come south, expecting enemies in white skin and allies in black. Marie defied those categories. She was both victim and perpetrator, oppressed and oppressor, shaped by the same system she now manipulated to her advantage. That complexity terrified him more than any plantation owner's straightforward brutality. In late autumn, he sent a long letter to his colleagues in Boston. We have constructed, perhaps unconsciously, an image of the enslaved and their descendants that admits only of sainthood or suffering. Here I have encountered something far more unsettling. A woman born into bondage who has, through intelligence and ruthlessness, climbed to a position of extraordinary power, only to reproduce the same structures of domination upon those beneath her. She is what this system creates when it is not killing us. He debated whether to act publicly. Exposing Marie would mean confronting not just a local figure, but an entire city's mythology. White elites used her as a convenient explanation for their own compromised consciences. Free people of color saw in her success a rare symbol of black agency, even if that agency came at a cost they preferred not to calculate. The decision was made for him when he received an unexpected visitor. Josephine, now in her early 30s, appeared at the boarding house where Frederick rented a room. She waited until they were alone in the courtyard before speaking. "Sir," she began, glancing over her shoulder, "I heard you've been asking questions about Madame Laveau." Frederick studied her carefully. He remembered seeing her name in the records, remembered the trajectory of her life, written in dried ink across decades. Purchased by Marie, loaned to various households, returned, never freed. "I have," he said. "And you are—" "Someone been hers too long." She took a steadying breath. "You think she's some kind of saint?" "She ain't. But you already know that, don't you?" He nodded once. "Tell me what you know, in your own words." What spilled out over the next hour confirmed his worst suspicions and added details no ledger could capture. Josephine spoke of nights when Marie had her copy letters stolen from desks and delivered to her for reading before being returned. Of how she placed fair-skinned slaves as concubines in white men's homes, then demanded payments later to keep silent. Of how she used rumors of curses as much as actual rituals to keep clients and enemies off balance. "She got white folks scared of her," Josephine said, "but she got us scared worse, 'cause she ain't just got whips. She got papers. She know everything. Who try to run, who talk to abolitionists, who think about uprising. She sell that news when it suit her." Frederick's throat tightened. "You mean she has informed on fugitives?" Josephine looked at him with a mixture of pity and anger. "You think them patrollers just know where to go by magic?" That night, Frederick drafted an article for a Boston newspaper, under the title, "The Voodoo Queen's Other Face, a Free Woman of Color, as Slave Trader in New Orleans." He described the property records, the slave sales, the testimonies of those who had served her. He framed Marie not as an aberration, but as a logical product of a system so corrupt that even its victims, given a sliver of power, learned to survive by exploiting others. The article went to press in early 1857. Copies found their way back to New Orleans within weeks. He expected outrage among abolitionists. Instead, he received silence from Boston and hostility from his own neighbors. "You Northerners," a free black shopkeeper told him coldly, "come down here for 5 minutes and think you understand our lives. You print lies about one of the only people who ever made white folks afraid, and you call that justice?" When Frederick pointed to the records, to the names and dates, the man shrugged. "White masters sell us every day. You write about one black woman, and suddenly you care." White elites reacted with a different kind of anger. By implying that Marie's empire was built on their secrets, Frederick had poked a hornet's nest of fear. Within a month, his landlord terminated his lease. Employers who had promised him legal work stopped returning his calls. Anonymous notes appeared under his door. "Yankee, go home." One evening he found his belongings dumped onto the street, soaked from a sudden downpour. He considered going to Marie herself, confronting her with the article, demanding some moral accounting. Instead, she came to him. He opened his door one afternoon to find her standing on the threshold, dressed not in the bright colors she wore at public ceremonies, but in a simple dark dress and head wrap. Behind her, 2 of her male slaves waited, impassive. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice calm. "May I come in?" He stepped aside. Anger burned in his chest, but curiosity kept him silent. She looked around the small room, taking in the half-packed suitcase, the scattered papers, the air of impending departure. "You have been busy," she remarked. "Visiting archives, talking to my people." "They're not your people," Frederick snapped. "They're people you own." "A distinction without a difference in this city," she replied. "But you already understand that, or you would not be leaving." He stiffened. "You had me evicted." "I made some calls," she admitted. "The men who rented you this room owe me favors." I reminded them. "Why?" he demanded. "Because I told the truth?" "Because you told a partial truth in a world that cannot handle complexity," she corrected. "You painted me as monster so your northern friends could sleep better. They prefer their stories simple. Black saint, white devil. It comforts them." Frederick gestured toward his scattered research. "You buy and sell human beings. You inform on runaways. You profit from suffering. What complexity do you think excuses that?" "None," she said quietly. "I offer no excuse, only context." For the first time, he saw something like weariness in her eyes. "I was born into a world built on chains," she continued. "White men wrote its rules. Those rules said that my mother was property, that my children, had I been born enslaved, would be property. I did not ask for that world, Mr. Thompson, but I learned to live in it, to master it. And when I finally held the whip instead of feeling it, I discovered something ugly. Power feels the same in every hand. That makes you no better than them." She inclined her head. "Perhaps. But understand this. Destroying me will not destroy the system. It will only remove one black woman who learned to use it for herself, while millions of others still suffer with nothing." He wanted to argue, to insist that individual choices still mattered, that moral lines existed even within unjust structures. But the floor beneath his certainties had already begun to crack. Marie did not need his condemnation. She had lived with worse from men far more dangerous than a northern lawyer. "Leave New Orleans," she said finally. "Your work here is done. Go back to Boston. Write your books. Give your speeches. The war that is coming will not care about one woman in New Orleans, nor about the slaves she bought or sold. It will be fought in blood and metal, not in ledgers. And you? He asked. I will do what I have always done, she replied. Survive. When she left, Frederick sat alone in the suddenly quiet room, the weight of his failure settling around him. He had tried to expose a hypocrite and found instead a mirror reflecting the system he fought against in its most uncomfortable form. A slave turned master, a victim turned perpetrator, a woman who embodied both the horror of bondage and the corruption that power, once acquired, could inflict on anyone. He left New Orleans a week later, his reputation tarnished, his certainties fractured. In Boston, his article about Marie Laveau was quietly forgotten, overshadowed by more straightforward tales of Southern cruelty that fit neatly into abolitionist pamphlets. Marie remained exactly where she had always been, at the center of a web of favors, debts, and secrets, her empire cracked but not broken, her legend growing even as the darker truths of her power sank, for the moment, back into the shadows. In 2018, a graduate student at Tulane University opened a box of yellowed property records that had been sealed for 137 years and discovered that New Orleans' most celebrated black icon had owned more slaves than some of the white families, whose racism the city now officially condemned. And that revelation would force an entire city to choose between its comfortable mythology and an uncomfortable truth. Dr. Ava Chen did not set out to destroy a legend. She was simply trying to finish her dissertation on economic networks among free people of color in antebellum Louisiana when the archivist at the New Orleans Public Library handed her a dusty box marked Orleans Parish Estate Records, 1850-1890, restricted access until 2015. The restriction period had expired 3 years earlier, but no one had bothered to request the files. Ava was the first. Inside, among probate documents and property transfers, she found Marie Laveau's will. The document itself was unremarkable. Standard legal language disposing of real estate, furniture, personal effects. What made Ava's hands tremble as she photographed each page was the attached inventory of assets dated 1881, the year of Marie's death. Listed between silver candlesticks and mahogany armoire were the names of 19 people still held in bondage, their ages and skills catalogued like livestock. But the Emancipation Proclamation had freed all slaves in 1863. The Civil War had ended in 1865. How could Marie Laveau, who died in 1881, still own human beings 16 years after abolition? Ava spent the next 6 months unraveling the answer, and what she found would ignite the most contentious historical debate New Orleans had seen in decades. The truth was as elegant as it was horrifying. Marie had never technically freed most of her slaves after the war. Instead, she had converted their legal status from property to indentured servants through contracts that bound them to her service for periods of 10 to 20 years, in exchange for room, board, and nominal wages so low they could never save enough to leave. The contracts, which she had drawn up with the help of a sympathetic lawyer in 1865, exploited a loophole in Louisiana's post-war labor laws designed to help former slaves transition to freedom. On paper, her former slaves were free. In practice, they remained trapped. Ava cross-referenced names from the 1881 inventory with earlier slave purchase records she found in the New Orleans notarial archives. The pattern was unmistakable. Many of the people listed in Marie's estate had been purchased by her as children in the 1840s and 1850s. They had spent their entire lives in her service. Some had died still working for her. Others had been passed to her daughter after Marie's death, the bondage continuing into a new generation. One name in particular haunted Ava. Céline Broussard, age 58 at the time of Marie's death, described in the inventory as household cook, infirm. Céline's name appeared in an 1835 bill of sale, purchased by Marie Laveau at age 12 for $200. She had served Marie for 46 years. Ava tracked Céline's trail through baptismal records, death certificates, and cemetery logs. She died in 1883, 2 years after Marie, and was buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper's section of St. Louis Cemetery No. 2. No family attended her funeral. No marker indicated her name. Céline Broussard, who had cooked meals and scrubbed floors for nearly half a century under Marie Laveau's control, vanished into the earth as if she had never existed. Except now, Ava was pulling her back. The dissertation became an article. The article caught the attention of the Times-Picayune, which ran a front-page story under the headline, "The Dark Side of the Voodoo Queen. New research reveals Marie Laveau's post-war slave empire." The reaction was immediate and divided. Some historians welcomed the complexity. "We have mythologized Marie Laveau for so long that we forgot she was a human being operating within a brutal system," one professor told reporters. "This research doesn't diminish her intelligence or her remarkable ability to navigate power. It simply reminds us that intelligence can be used for good or ill." But for many in New Orleans, particularly within the city's black community, Ava's revelations felt like an attack on one of the few historical figures who represented black agency in a city built on slavery. "White people owned thousands of slaves and we build monuments to them," one community organizer argued at a heated public forum. "One black woman owns a few dozen, and suddenly that's the story we need to tell. This feels like tearing down our own." Ava understood the anger, but she refused to back down. At the forum, she stood before a crowd of several hundred people, her voice steady, despite the hostility radiating from some corners of the room. "I am not here to tear anyone down," she said. "I am here to tell the truth. And the truth is that Marie Laveau was shaped by a system of unimaginable cruelty, but she also participated in it. Both things can be true. We can acknowledge her brilliance and her survival instincts while also mourning the people she harmed. History is not a fairy tale. It's messy and contradictory, and the people we celebrate are often more complicated than we want them to be." A woman in the front row stood, her voice shaking. "My great-great-grandmother told stories about Marie Laveau saving our family. You're calling her a liar?" "I'm saying," Ava replied carefully, "that oral histories are valuable, but they are also shaped by what people wanted to remember and what they needed to forget. Marie Laveau helped some people. She harmed others. Both realities existed at the same time." The debate spilled into social media, op-eds, and city council meetings. A statue of Marie in Armstrong Park became a flashpoint. Some demanded it be removed or amended with a plaque acknowledging the full truth of her legacy. Others argued that removing it would be another erasure, another silencing of black history by those uncomfortable with its complexity. In the midst of the controversy, something unexpected happened. A woman named Jasmine Broussard, a 42-year-old nurse from Baton Rouge, contacted Ava through the university. She had seen the name Céline Broussard in the news coverage and recognized it from family stories. My grandmother used to talk about a Celine who worked for the Voodoo lady, Jasmine explained when they met at a cafe near campus. We always thought it was just a legend, something she made up to feel connected to history. Ava's hands trembled as she pulled out copies of the documents. Together they traced the genealogy. Celine had given birth to a daughter, Marie, named heartbreakingly after her mistress, in 1860. That daughter had survived, had children of her own, and the line led directly to Jasmine. She was never freed, Jasmine said quietly, staring at the 1881 inventory where her great-great-great-grandmother's name appeared. She died still working for that woman. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Jasmine asked, "What do we do now?" Ava had been asking herself the same question. The answer came in the form of a project she proposed to the city. A public memorial in Congo Square, where Marie had once performed her most famous voodoo ceremonies, dedicated not to Marie herself, but to the 127 people whose names appeared in historical records as her property. The proposal faced fierce opposition. Marie Laveau's defenders argued it was an act of erasure, an attempt to reduce a complex historical figure to her worst actions. But Ava and a growing coalition of historians, descendants, and community members pushed forward. "We are not erasing Marie Laveau," Ava said at a city council hearing. "We are adding the voices she silenced. There is room in our history for both her story and theirs." In 2020, the memorial was approved, a low bronze wall engraved with 127 names, as many as could be recovered from fragmentary records. Some entries read simply, "Female, age unknown, purchased 1842. Others had full names and ages. At the center was an inscription. "These names represent men, women, and children held in bondage by Marie Laveau between 1826 and 1881. Some were freed, most were not. They worked in her homes, businesses, and networks. Their labor built her legend. Their stories were buried in her shadow. We remember them now." On the day of the unveiling, Jasmine Broussard stood before the wall and traced her great-great-great-grandmother's name with her fingertips. Celine Broussard, 1823-1883. "She existed," Jasmine whispered. "She mattered." The statue of Marie Laveau remained in Armstrong Park, but the city added a new plaque that included language Ava had helped draft. Marie Laveau, 1794-1881, was a free woman of color who became one of New Orleans' most influential figures through her work as a hairdresser, spiritual advisor, and political operator. She navigated the brutal realities of a slave society with remarkable intelligence. She also participated in that system, owning and trading enslaved people for profit. Her legacy is complex, reflecting both the resilience required to survive oppression and the moral compromises that survival sometimes demanded. We honor her significance while acknowledging the harm her choices caused. Not everyone was satisfied. Some felt the plaque was too forgiving, others thought it too harsh. But Ava believed that discomfort was precisely the point. "History should make us uncomfortable," she said in an interview months after the memorial's dedication. "If we're only celebrating heroes and condemning villains, we're not learning anything." Marie Laveau's story forces us to confront the reality that oppressed people can become oppressors, that intelligence doesn't guarantee morality, that survival sometimes requires terrible choices, and that we, as descendants of that history, have a responsibility to tell all of it, not just the parts that make us feel good. The final chapter of Marie Laveau's story was still being written in living rooms and classrooms across New Orleans, where families confronted what it meant to claim her as an ancestor or inspiration. Some descendants of the people she owned met descendants of Marie herself at community forums, conversations awkward and painful, but necessary. At one such gathering, a woman who traced her lineage to Marie stood and addressed a man whose great-great-grandfather had been sold by Marie to a sugar plantation. "I can't apologize for her," she said, her voice breaking, "but I can listen, and I can make sure that when I tell her story to my children, I tell yours too." It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. But it was acknowledgement, which was more than Céline Broussard and the 126 others had received in their lifetimes. In 2023, Ava published her full study as a book, The Voodoo Queen's Ledger, Marie Laveau, and the Economics of Survival in Antebellum New Orleans. The final chapter was titled Reckoning. She ended it with a question she believed the city and the country still needed to answer. We have asked what Marie Laveau did. We have asked why she did it. Perhaps the harder question is this: what would we have done in her place? And if we believe we would have chosen differently, what evidence from our own lives proves we are capable of that choice when power, survival, and moral compromise collide? The book left readers unsettled, which was exactly Ava's intention. Marie Laveau had been dead for 142 years, but the questions her life raised were as urgent as ever. In a nation still grappling with the legacy of slavery, still navigating the complexities of race and power, her story offered no easy lessons, only the uncomfortable reminder that history's most compelling figures are rarely its simplest, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is remember not just the legends we want to celebrate, but the people those legends forgot.